The phone rang again after 20 missed calls. Zoe picked it up right away. "Hello, Mom." Angela's anxious voice came through the phone. "Zoe, where have you been? I still haven't received the money you were supposed to send yesterday. They're already calling again, asking for it. I tried calling you all day. Did something happen?" Zoe sat up on the narrow bed inside her crew cabin and rubbed her tired eyes. "I had a longer shift today, so I didn't have my phone with me. I'll send it in a few minutes." Before Zoe could say another word, Angela interrupted her. "Thank you, sweetheart. Your father and I are so proud of you. Get some rest." The line went dead. No goodbye, no questions about how she was doing. No one asked if she was eating well. For the past 10 years, every conversation with her parents had revolved around money. Zoe loved her parents too much to complain, but every call left a little more sadness inside her. 3 days earlier, the cruise ship had stopped at one of her favorite ports. She found a small handmade bag she had wanted for years. She picked it up, looked at it for a long time, then quietly placed it back on the shelf. It wasn't because she couldn't afford it. She simply couldn't bring herself to spend money on herself. Zoe set her phone aside, lay back on the bed, and covered her face with one hand. The tears she had been holding back finally spilled out. She cried until exhaustion took over. Just a few minutes later, after another 10-hour workday, she fell asleep once again. At 5 o'clock every morning, before most passengers on the cruise ship had even opened their eyes, Zoe was already awake. She quietly folded the thin blanket on her narrow bunk, put on her housekeeping uniform, tied her hair neatly behind her head, and hurried toward the crew assembly area. After the morning roll call, the housekeeping supervisor assigned everyone's section for the day. Zoe pushed a cart loaded with fresh towels, bed linens, toiletries, and cleaning supplies through the long hallways lined with luxury cabins. While vacationers were still enjoying breakfast or watching the sunrise from their balconies, she had already begun making beds, scrubbing bathrooms, vacuuming carpets, polishing mirrors, replacing amenities, and checking every corner to make sure each room looked untouched before its next guest arrived. The work was physically exhausting. Some days she barely had enough time to sit down for a proper meal before another cabin had to be cleaned. Yet no matter how tired she was, Zoe never rushed through her work. Every towel was folded neatly. Every pillow was placed exactly the same way. Every guest room was left looking as if no one had ever stayed there before. Guests often left handwritten thank you notes on the desk before checking out. Zoe rarely kept them. She simply folded each note, smiled to herself, and went back to work. More than a year had passed since Zoe first stepped onto this cruise ship. The work was harder than she had imagined, and she spent most of the year far away from home. But compared to many jobs she could have found back home, this one paid far better. As long as she stayed healthy and kept working hard, she believed the sacrifices would eventually be worth it. That simple routine repeated itself almost every single day. Wake up before dawn, clean cabins until her body ached, finish one voyage, begin another. Zoe never complained. She believed every day she worked brought her one step closer to the future she had always dreamed of. Every month, after receiving her salary and tips, Zoe followed the same routine. She transferred a portion of the money to her savings account, then carefully recorded the new balance in a small notebook she always kept inside her locker. Whenever the total grew a little higher, she couldn't help smiling to herself. It wasn't a fortune, but to Zoe, every dollar represented another step toward the life she wanted to build. During her breaks, she would sometimes browse real estate listings on her phone. She wasn't looking at luxury homes or expensive neighborhoods. She always searched for small one-bedroom apartments that an ordinary working woman could realistically afford. She imagined decorating a tiny living room with warm lights, cooking dinner after work, and finally having a place she could truly call home. It didn't need to be perfect. It only needed to belong to her. Zoe often told herself that if she worked on the cruise ship for another few years, lived simply, and continued saving every paycheck, that dream would eventually come true. Whenever the thought crossed her mind, the endless hours of cleaning cabins somehow felt a little easier to endure. She closed the real estate app, slipped her phone back into her pocket, and returned to work with a quiet smile on her face. At that moment, Zoe still believed that her future was entirely in her own hands. One afternoon, just after finishing another shift, Zoe was about to head back to her cabin when her phone suddenly rang. The screen showed her mother's name. She smiled as she answered, thinking Angela was simply calling to check on her. "Hi, Mom." Instead of hearing the familiar warmth in her mother's voice, Zoe was met with quiet sobbing. "Zoe!" Angela struggled to speak between tears. "Something terrible has happened." Zoe's smile disappeared instantly. "Mom, what's wrong?" There was a long silence before Angela finally answered. "Your father? He's in the hospital." Zoe felt her heart skip a beat. "What happened? Is he okay?" Angela tried to calm herself before continuing. "Your father was tricked into an investment. We lost everything. The house was used as collateral. If we can't pay the money back, we'll lose it." Zoe stood frozen in the empty hallway, gripping her phone so tightly that her fingers began to ache. Nothing Angela had just said felt real. Just a few months earlier, her parents had told her everything at home was fine. "Where's Ronald?" Zoe asked immediately. Another silence followed. This time, it lasted even longer. "He disappeared after everything happened," Angela whispered. "We've been trying to reach him, but he won't answer our calls. We don't even know where he is anymore." Zoe slowly leaned against the wall beside her. Her mind was racing, trying to understand how her family had fallen apart in such a short time. Angela's voice trembled once again. "Right now, you're the only person we have left, Zoe." Zoe lowered her head without saying a word. For the first time since she had started working on the cruise ship, she felt something far heavier than physical exhaustion settle on her shoulders. Zoe closed her eyes and took a slow breath, hoping she had misunderstood what she had just heard. "How much do we owe?" she asked quietly. Angela didn't answer right away. She seemed to be gathering the courage to say the number out loud. $200,000. Zoe's mind went completely blank. For a few seconds, she thought she had heard the wrong number. "How much, Mom?" she asked again, her voice barely above a whisper. $200,000, Angela repeated, crying even harder. "Your father believed the wrong people. They convinced him the investment couldn't fail. He borrowed money, mortgaged the house, and then everything collapsed. If we can't pay them back, they'll take our home." Zoe slowly lowered herself onto a nearby chair in the crew hallway. She stared blankly at the floor, unable to process what she had just heard. $200,000. Even with the salary she earned on the cruise ship, it would take years of saving to put together that kind of money. The small apartment she had dreamed about only minutes earlier suddenly felt farther away than ever before. It was as if someone had erased her future with a single number. She finally forced herself to speak. "Mom, I have to get back to work. Let me think about it first. I'll call you later." The relief in Angela's voice was impossible to hide. "Thank you, Zoe. Thank you so much. Your father and I don't know what we'd do without you." Before Zoe could ask another question about Adam's condition, the call had already ended. She remained seated for a long time, staring at the dark screen of her phone. The number Angela had spoken kept echoing in her mind. $200,000. It was more than a debt. It was a crossroads that could change the rest of her life. For the rest of the afternoon, Zoe moved from one cabin to another as if her body were working on instinct while her mind was somewhere else. She changed sheets, scrubbed bathrooms, vacuumed carpets, and smiled politely whenever a guest greeted her. But she couldn't remember finishing a single room. Every few minutes, the same number flashed through her mind. $200,000. During her short break, she sat alone in the crew cafeteria with her untouched meal growing cold in front of her. She opened the banking app on her phone and looked at the savings she had spent more than a year building. It had taken countless early mornings, endless shifts, and months of living as simply as possible just to save that amount. She quietly did the math in her head. If she kept working, kept saving every paycheck, and never wasted money, she could eventually buy the small apartment she had always dreamed about. It wasn't a luxurious dream. It was simply a life that belonged to her. Then she thought about her parents. She pictured Adam lying in a hospital bed. She imagined Angela sitting outside his room, terrified that strangers might come and take away the family home. She thought about Ronald, who had disappeared without a word, leaving their parents to face everything alone. Zoe slowly locked her phone and slipped it back into her pocket. She leaned back in her chair and stared silently through the cafeteria window at the endless ocean outside. For the first time in more than a year, she realized she couldn't save both her future and her family. She had to choose one. That night, Zoe lay awake in her bunk long after the rest of the crew had fallen asleep. She kept replaying the conversation with her mother, hoping another solution would somehow appear if she thought about it long enough. It never did. No matter how many times she weighed her options, every path led to the same choice. She reached for her phone and dialed Angela's number. The call was answered almost immediately, as if her mother had been waiting beside the phone the entire time. "Mom." Zoe took a deep breath before continuing. "I'll help pay the debt." For a moment, Angela couldn't speak. Zoe could only hear quiet sobs coming from the other end of the line. "Thank you. Thank you so much, Zoe," Angela whispered through her tears. "Your father and I will never forget what you're doing for us." Zoe closed her eyes. "I can't promise I'll pay it off quickly. It'll take years, but I'll send home everything I can until it's gone." "That's enough," Angela replied. "That's more than enough." After the call ended, Zoe opened her banking app and transferred nearly all of the money she had spent more than a year saving. She watched the balance in her account drop to a number she hadn't seen since the first month she started working on the cruise ship. Then she quietly closed the app, changed into her uniform for the next day's shift, and placed her name tag back into her pocket. When the alarm rang before dawn the following morning, Zoe got out of bed just as she always did. She folded her blanket, put on her uniform, and walked toward the crew assembly area without saying a word. From that morning on, every cabin she cleaned, every hallway she walked, and every dollar she earned no longer belonged to the future she had once dreamed of. They belonged to a debt she believed was saving her family. The first paycheck Zoe received after making her decision looked no different from the ones before it. The number on the screen was the same. The generous tips from grateful passengers were still there. But this time, the money no longer represented a future she was building for herself. It represented another payment toward the debt that had nearly destroyed her family. As soon as the salary reached her account, Zoe transferred almost everything back home. She left herself only enough to cover the bare necessities she needed while living on the ship. There was nothing left for new clothes, vacations, or anything she didn't absolutely need. After the transfer was complete, she took out a small notebook she had bought shortly after receiving the call from her mother. On the first page, she carefully wrote one sentence. Family debt, $200,000. Beneath it, she recorded the amount she had just sent home. Then she drew a small line through that number. It wasn't much compared to the debt that still remained, but seeing the first payment written on paper gave her a strange sense of relief. At least she had finally begun. From that day forward, the notebook became as important to Zoe as her passport and crewid. Every payday followed exactly the same routine. Her salary arrived. She transferred nearly all of it to her parents. She opened the notebook. She wrote down another payment. Then she quietly closed it and returned to work. The balance moved down little by little, one paycheck at a time. Every amount she crossed off reminded her that her parents were one step closer to keeping their home. Although the journey ahead still seemed impossibly long, Zoe never regretted the decision she had made. She believed that every cabin she cleaned, every bed she made, and every dollar she earned was slowly bringing her family back to safety. Without realizing it, she had already stepped onto a journey that would consume the next 10 years of her life. Months gradually turned into years. The pages inside Zoe's notebook slowly filled with dates, transfer amounts, and crossed-out numbers. Every time she looked at the remaining balance, it was a little smaller than before. For the first time since leaving home, she felt as though all of her sacrifices were leading somewhere. Her parents called more often than before. This time, the conversations weren't just about asking for money. Angela would tell her how much of the debt had already been repaid. Adam would occasionally get on the phone to thank her and remind her not to work too hard. "We're getting there," he would say. "We couldn't have done this without you." Those simple words were enough to keep Zoe going. Sometimes, after crossing off another payment, Zoe would simply close the notebook and sit quietly for a moment. Watching the remaining balance shrink was enough to remind her why she kept going. Sometimes she even smiled to herself before closing it again. The debt still looked enormous, but for the first time, she could actually see it getting smaller. Whenever the work became overwhelming, Zoe reminded herself why she had chosen this path. Every aching muscle, Every sleepless morning and every holiday spent at sea meant her parents were one step closer to saving their home. That thought made even the hardest days easier to endure. She stopped counting how many voyages she had completed. She only counted how much closer her family was to becoming free again. As long as the number inside that notebook kept shrinking, Zoe believed every sacrifice she made was worth it. Before Zoe realized it, nearly 10 years had quietly slipped away. The young woman who had stepped onto the cruise ship believing she would only stay for a few years had become one of the most experienced housekeepers on board. Thousands of passengers had come and gone. Countless voyages had begun and ended. Yet Zoe's own life seemed to have remained exactly where it was. At every port the ship visited, the crew was free to go ashore whenever their schedule allowed. Most of Zoe's coworkers spent those precious hours exploring local markets, trying new restaurants, or buying small souvenirs to take home. Zoe usually walked with them for a while before stopping in front of a shop window. Some days it was a dress displayed behind a shop window. Other times it was nothing more than a simple handbag or a pair of shoes. Zoe would stop for a few seconds, look at the price tag, smile to herself, and quietly walk away. It wasn't because she couldn't afford those things anymore. It was because every dollar she chose not to spend could become another payment toward her family's debt. Over the years, she stopped taking vacations. She volunteered to work during holidays whenever overtime was available. While some of her coworkers got married, started families, or eventually left the cruise line to begin new chapters in their lives, Zoe remained exactly where she had always been. Her world became little more than cabins, hallways, laundry rooms, and the endless ocean outside the ship's windows. The phone calls from home slowly changed as the years passed. In the beginning, Angela always asked if Zoe was eating well, if she was sleeping enough, or if work had become too exhausting. Later, those questions became less frequent. Eventually, most conversations began with the same sentence. "Did you send the money?" Zoe never thought much about it. She simply assumed the pressure of the debt had left her parents too worried to think about anything else. Every time she hung up the phone, she reminded herself that it would all be over one day. As long as she kept going a little longer, everything would be worth it. Without realizing it, she had already given almost all of her 20s to a future she believed she was saving for the people she loved. Late one evening, after finishing another voyage, Zoe received another call from her mother. Unlike the countless anxious phone calls she had answered over the years, Angela sounded happier than she had in a long time. "Zoe," she said excitedly, "we've finally paid off most of it. There's only a little left now." Zoe sat down on the edge of her bed without realizing she was smiling. "Really?" "Yes," Angela replied. "If everything goes well, it won't be much longer." After ending the call, Zoe took out the notebook she had carried with her for nearly 10 years. The remaining balance had become smaller than she had ever imagined possible. She slowly ran her fingers across the numbers before closing the cover. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to think about something other than debt. She imagined finishing one last contract before leaving the cruise line for good. She imagined buying a small apartment, just like the one she used to look at on her phone years ago. She imagined waking up in a place that belonged to her instead of another crew cabin. Most of all, she imagined living close to her parents again. Maybe they could finally sit down together for dinner without worrying about money. Maybe they could make up for all the birthdays, holidays, and family gatherings she had missed while working at sea. Those simple dreams, which she had buried for almost a decade, quietly returned one by one. Zoe leaned back against the wall of her cabin and closed her eyes. For the first time in many years, the future no longer felt impossibly far away. It finally felt close enough to reach. A few days later, Angela called again. This time, Zoe answered almost immediately. She could hear excitement in her mother's voice before a single word was spoken. "Zoe, there's only one payment left, just one more, and it'll all be over." Zoe couldn't stop herself from smiling. She lowered her head and let out a long breath she felt she had been holding for almost 10 years. "Really?" "Yes," Angela replied happily. "Just one last payment." After hanging up, Zoe sat quietly for several minutes. She looked around the small crew cabin that had been her home for nearly a decade. The narrow bed, the small locker, the tiny desk by the wall. She had always believed she would only stay there for a few years. Somehow, 10 years had slipped away before she even realized it. That evening, she walked into the crew office and signed up for one final contract. It was a 4-month world cruise that would sail across several continents before returning to the United States. When the voyage ended, Zoe planned to resign from the cruise line for good. She would go home, help her parents finish the last payment, and finally begin living the life she had postponed for so many years. As she signed her name on the contract, she couldn't help smiling again. The hardest chapter of her life was finally coming to an end. She had no way of knowing that the journey she had just agreed to would change her life forever. Not because of the places the ship would visit, but because of one passenger she had not yet met. 4 months. That was how long the world cruise would be away before returning to the United States. It was also the final contract Zoe had promised herself she would ever sign. Unlike the shorter voyages she had worked over the past decade, this journey would carry passengers across several continents before finally bringing everyone home. On the morning of embarkation, the ship buzzed with activity. Crew members hurried through the hallways, luggage carts rolled in one after another, and thousands of excited passengers stepped aboard, ready for the journey of a lifetime. Among them was Autumn Anderson, a 68-year-old widow from Charleston, South Carolina. It was the first long trip she had taken since losing her husband 5 years earlier. At her son's encouragement, she had finally decided it was time to see the world again. Zoe was assigned to care for Autumn's cabin throughout the voyage. Their first meeting lasted less than a minute. Zoe introduced herself with a polite smile, explained that she would be responsible for the room, then quietly began preparing the cabin for its new guest. Over the next several days, Autumn rarely spoke to her beyond a simple greeting. Yet she couldn't help noticing the young housekeeper. Every morning, Zoe was already working before most passengers had finished breakfast. Every afternoon, the cabin looked spotless, with every towel neatly folded, every pillow perfectly arranged, and even the smallest details carefully attended to. More than once, Autumn noticed Zoe quietly straightening a picture frame or replacing fresh flowers that hadn't even begun to wilt. None of those things had been requested. No one would have complained if she had skipped them. Yet Zoe did them anyway before quietly moving on to the next cabin. Autumn found herself watching the young woman walk down the hallway one morning after she finished cleaning. There was nothing extraordinary about Zoe's job, but there was something unusual about the care she put into work most people would never notice. Without realizing it, Autumn had begun paying attention to her. As the voyage continued, Autumn's curiosity quietly grew. Without asking anyone about Zoe, she simply paid closer attention whenever their paths happened to cross. One afternoon, while changing the bed linens, Zoe found an expensive diamond bracelet hidden beneath a pillow. She immediately stopped what she was doing, placed it inside a lost and found envelope, and personally delivered it to guest services. Later that evening, the passenger returned in tears after realizing the bracelet was missing. When she learned Zoe had found it, she insisted on giving her several $100s as a reward. Zoe smiled politely and gently shook her head. "I'm just glad you have it back." She wished the woman a pleasant evening before quietly leaving the cabin. A few days later, one of the housekeeping staff twisted her ankle while pushing a fully loaded cart through a narrow hallway. Zoe finished cleaning her own section first, then returned to help her coworker complete the remaining cabins before the passengers came back. She never mentioned it to their supervisor and never expected anyone to thank her. Autumn happened to witness both moments without Zoe realizing it. The young woman never seemed to choose the harder path because someone was watching. She never turned around to see whether anyone had noticed. She simply pushed her cart toward the next cabin. Standing by her cabin door later that afternoon, Autumn watched Zoe disappear around the corner with her housekeeping cart. A quiet smile crossed her face. She had been right to pay attention. The young woman wasn't simply hardworking. She was someone whose character could be trusted. About a month into the voyage, the ship docked at a quiet coastal town in southern Europe. Zoe had finished her morning duties earlier than usual, so she finally had a couple of hours before reporting back for the evening shift. She stepped off the ship with no real destination in mind. Like always, she simply wanted to walk around before returning to work. By coincidence, Autumn was strolling through the same street. When she saw Zoe, she smiled warmly. "Would you mind keeping an old woman company for a little while?" Zoe smiled and nodded. The two of them wandered through the narrow streets lined with small cafes, family-owned shops, and flower-covered balconies. Autumn occasionally stopped to admire the scenery, while Zoe quietly listened to her stories about the places she had visited with her late husband many years ago. At one point, They reached a small overlook facing the sea. Autumn looked around before asking a simple question. If you could design a trip for people my age, what would you do differently? Zoe thought for a moment before answering. I wouldn't try to fit too many places into one trip. After a while, people stop remembering where they were because they're always rushing to the next stop. Autumn listened without interrupting. Zoe continued, I'd choose fewer places, but stay longer. Somewhere peaceful. Somewhere people could actually slow down, eat good local food, talk to each other, and feel like they were visiting family instead of checking places off a list. She smiled a little before adding, most people don't remember every famous landmark they visit. They remember how a place made them feel. Autumn looked at Zoe with quiet surprise. That wasn't the answer she expected from a housekeeper. It sounded more like someone who had spent years thinking about what travelers truly needed instead of simply where they wanted to go. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Autumn simply looked out toward the ocean again, but this time her thoughts were no longer on the beautiful coastline in front of her. They were on the young woman standing beside her. For the first time, Autumn realized that Zoe possessed something far more valuable than diligence and kindness. She had insight, and that was something no job title could ever measure. Several weeks later, after another long day of work, Zoe walked out onto one of the quiet observation decks reserved for crew members. The passengers were already enjoying dinner, leaving the open deck almost empty except for the sound of waves breaking against the side of the ship. Zoe leaned against the railing and stared into the darkness. She didn't notice Autumn until the older woman slowly walked over and stood beside her. Neither of them spoke for a while. Autumn simply looked out at the ocean with her. After a long silence, she turned slightly towards Zoe and asked, Are you okay? Zoe smiled almost automatically. I'm fine, Autumn returned the smile, but gently shook her head. It's okay. She paused for a moment before adding softly, You don't have to be strong in front of me. Those few words were enough to break the wall Zoe had spent 10 years building around herself. She lowered her head and laughed quietly, trying to hide the tears already filling her eyes. I've spent almost 10 years sending nearly everything I earn back home, she said. Sometimes I see something I really like, and I stand there thinking about buying it, but I always put it back. She swallowed hard before continuing. Every time I think the debt is almost gone, there's still another payment waiting. I keep telling myself that once it's over, I'll finally live for myself. Her voice suddenly caught in her throat. I don't even know what living for myself looks like anymore. Zoe couldn't force out another word. She covered her face as years of exhaustion, loneliness, and quiet sacrifice poured out all at once. She cried harder than she could ever remember crying. For the first time in almost a decade, she stopped pretending she was okay. Autumn didn't interrupt. She didn't offer advice. She simply stepped closer and gently wrapped her arms around Zoe, letting the young woman cry against her shoulder for as long as she needed. Tears slowly gathered in Autumn's own eyes. She understood that these weren't tears from one difficult day. They were tears that had been waiting 10 years for someone safe enough to witness them. When Zoe finally calmed down, Autumn's eyes glistened as she gently squeezed her hand. Don't lose hope, she said quietly. There was a time when I believed my life would never get better either. She looked out across the dark ocean before continuing. But it did, Autumn gently squeezed Zoe's hand. Yours will too. Zoe didn't answer. She simply nodded. For the first time in many years, she felt as though someone had truly listened instead of simply hearing her words. And somehow, that alone made tomorrow feel a little lighter than yesterday. 4 months passed far more quickly than either of them expected. One by one, the ports, cities, and countries disappeared behind the ship until the final morning arrived. Crew members were busy preparing for disembarkation while passengers packed their luggage for the journey home. Zoe pushed her housekeeping cart down the familiar hallway one last time before stopping outside Autumn's cabin. She knocked gently on the door. Come in, Autumn answered. The room was almost empty. Only a single suitcase remained beside the door. Zoe completed her final inspection, folded the last towel, and quietly looked around the cabin she had cared for every day throughout the voyage. Everything's ready, she said with a smile. I hope you enjoyed your trip, Autumn smiled back. I did. She paused for a moment before adding, but meeting you was the best part of it. Zoe lowered her eyes, embarrassed by the compliment. She thanked Autumn politely and turned to leave. Zoe, Autumn's voice stopped her at the doorway. She reached into her handbag and took out a simple business card before walking over and placing it gently into Zoe's hand. Zoe glanced down. It was Autumn's personal contact information. "Keep it," Autumn said with a gentle smile. "If you ever need anything," she paused for a brief moment. "Call me." That was all she said. She didn't offer money. She didn't promise to solve Zoe's problems. She simply left a door open if Zoe ever chose to walk through it. Zoe carefully slipped the card into her wallet. "Thank you," she said sincerely. "I hope we'll meet again someday." Autumn smiled without answering. Somehow, she felt they would. A few hours later, the passengers slowly left the ship one after another. Standing on the crew deck, Zoe watched Autumn disappear into the crowd until she could no longer see her. Then she quietly returned to finish the last of her duties. She believed the hardest part of her journey was finally over. All that remained was to return home, make one final payment, and begin the life she had been waiting almost 10 years to live. 4 months later, the world cruise finally came to an end. As the ship slowly pulled into port, Zoe stood quietly on the crew deck, watching the city skyline grow larger through the morning mist. After almost 10 years of living from one voyage to the next, she was finally going home. This time, not as someone leaving for another contract, but as someone ready to begin a new life. Before leaving the port, Zoe stopped by a few small shops nearby. She didn't buy anything expensive. She chose a warm jacket for her father, a scarf for her mother, and a simple leather wallet for Ronald. They were modest gifts, but they were the first presents she had bought for her family in many years. Holding the shopping bags in her hands, she smiled to herself. Soon, she would finally be able to spend time with them instead of only sending money from thousands of miles away. During the drive back to her hometown, Zoe kept imagining the dinner they would share that evening. She wondered if her father had fully recovered. She wondered whether her mother still cooked her favorite meals. She even imagined Ronald joking about how much older she looked after spending so many years working at sea. During the drive home, Zoe found herself wondering whether her father still made coffee every morning and whether her mother still hummed while cooking dinner. She smiled without realizing it. When the taxi finally stopped in front of the familiar old house, Zoe sat still for a few seconds before opening the door. The house looked almost exactly the way she remembered it. Even the flower pots near the front porch were still in the same place. Before she had the chance to knock, the front door opened. Angela hurried outside first and wrapped both arms tightly around her daughter. Adam followed a few steps behind, smiling with tears already forming in his eyes. For a brief moment, none of them said anything. They simply stood there, holding one another after nearly 10 years apart. As Zoe stepped inside the house, a feeling she hadn't experienced in a very long time quietly returned to her. Home. She looked around the familiar living room and smiled. The hardest years of her life were finally over. From now on, she believed, everything would only get better. The first evening felt almost exactly the way Zoe had imagined during all those years at sea. Angela prepared a table full of homemade dishes, insisting Zoe eat more every few minutes. Adam asked about life on the cruise ship, while Ronald sat quietly across the table, speaking far less than she remembered. Zoe assumed he had simply become more mature with age. After dinner, she smiled and said, "Tomorrow I'll go to the bank and transfer the last payment. After that, everything will finally be over." The room suddenly fell silent. Adam lowered his eyes and slowly picked up his cup without drinking. Angela forced a smile but quickly changed the subject. "You've just come home. We can talk about that later." Zoe didn't think much of it. She simply nodded. The next morning, while helping her mother clean the kitchen, Zoe asked again, "How much is left now?" Angela paused for just a second before answering, "Not much." "How much is not much?" Zoe asked with a smile. "I just want to know exactly when we'll be done." Before Angela could answer, Adam called from the living room, giving her an excuse to walk away. Zoe stood there for a moment, watching her mother's back disappear around the corner. A strange feeling settled quietly inside her. Over the next 2 days, the same thing happened again and again. Every time Zoe mentioned the debt, someone changed the subject. Whenever she asked to see the paperwork, Adam said he had put everything away. Angela always said they would look at it another day. Ronald barely joined the conversation at all. Whenever Zoe looked at him, He quickly lowered his head as though avoiding her eyes. The more she thought about it, the more everything began to feel wrong. For 10 years, the debt had been the center of every phone call they shared. Now that she was finally home and ready to finish it, no one seemed willing to talk about it. That night, Zoe lay awake in her childhood bedroom, staring at the ceiling. For the first time since returning home, a question quietly entered her mind. What was everyone trying so hard to hide? The following morning, Zoe woke up earlier than everyone else. She quietly walked into the kitchen to make coffee when she noticed Adam and Angela talking in hushed voices in the backyard. She wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but one sentence made her stop where she stood. Ronald still hasn't paid back the investors, Adam said quietly. If they come looking for him again, what are we supposed to do? Zoe frowned. Investors? She thought her father had been the one who lost the money. She took another step closer without making a sound. Angela let out a tired sigh. He's trying. Give him more time. 10 years, Adam replied, his voice heavy with regret. Zoe gave us 10 years. How much longer are we going to let her carry this? Zoe felt her entire body go cold. She couldn't hear anything else. The words kept echoing inside her head. Ronald, 10 years. Carry this. Her hands began to tremble. She slowly pushed the back door open and looked at her parents. The sound made both of them freeze. Their faces turned pale the moment they saw her standing there. Zoe looked from her father to her mother, searching for someone to tell her she had misunderstood. No one spoke. What did Dad mean? She asked quietly. Neither of them answered. I asked. Her voice cracked for the first time. What did he mean? Adam lowered his head. Angela's eyes immediately filled with tears. The silence between them became more painful than any answer could have been. Finally, Adam forced himself to speak. The debt. He couldn't continue. Angela covered her mouth as she began crying. It wasn't your father who invested the money. Zoe stared at her mother without blinking. Then who? Angela closed her eyes. Ronald. The world around Zoe seemed to disappear. The hospital. The investment. The house. The desperate phone calls. Every overtime shift. Every birthday she had missed. Every dollar she had sent home. Every dream she had buried. None of it had happened because her father had made a terrible mistake. Ronald had borrowed money with friends after graduating from college, convinced he could become rich overnight through risky investments. When everything collapsed, he was too ashamed to face the consequences and disappeared, leaving Adam and Angela to deal with the creditors. Terrified that Zoe would refuse to help if she knew the truth, they told her the debt belonged to her father instead. For 10 years, Zoe had believed she was saving her parents. In reality, she had been paying for a lie. Zoe stood perfectly still. Even breathing suddenly felt difficult. The backyard remained exactly the same, yet nothing around her felt familiar anymore. No one spoke for a long time. Angela was the first to break the silence. She walked toward Zoe with tears streaming down her face before suddenly dropping to her knees. I'm sorry, she cried. Mom, Zoe whispered, instinctively taking half a step back. Adam slowly knelt beside his wife. The man Zoe had always looked up to could no longer meet his daughter's eyes. This is my fault, he said quietly. I should have told you the truth from the beginning. A few seconds later, Ronald walked out of the house. The moment he saw his parents kneeling in front of Zoe, he understood everything. He stopped several feet away and lowered his head. He didn't try to defend himself. He didn't blame anyone else. I'm sorry, Zoe. His voice shook so badly that he could barely finish the sentence. I ruined your life. Angela cried even harder. We were afraid you'd abandon this family if you knew the truth. We thought we could fix everything before you came home. We never imagined it would take this long. Adam slowly shook his head. Every year we wanted to tell you. He closed his eyes. Every year we were too ashamed. Ronald finally looked up, his eyes red with tears. I wanted to tell you so many times, he swallowed hard. I just didn't have the courage. Zoe listened quietly. She didn't interrupt. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't ask why. None of those answers could return the 10 years she had lost. She looked at each member of her family one by one. They were all crying. They all regretted what they had done. But standing there, Zoe suddenly realized something that hurt even more than the lie itself. For 10 years, she had believed every sacrifice she made was bringing her closer to her family. Now she understood that every sacrifice had only pushed her farther away from herself. She slowly took a deep breath. Then she looked at her parents with calm eyes. The decision she had avoided for the past few minutes had finally become clear. Without saying another word, Zoe turned around and walked back into the house. Adam quickly stood up. "Zoe," she didn't answer. She calmly walked into the bedroom where she had slept for the past few nights and opened the small suitcase she had brought home from the cruise ship. One by one, she folded her clothes and placed them back inside. The gifts she had bought for her family remained exactly where they were. She didn't take them back. A few minutes later, she zipped up the suitcase and carried it toward the front door. Angela rushed after her, tears covering her face. "Please don't leave." Zoe stopped for the first time since packing her belongings. She slowly turned around and looked at the 3 people standing behind her. They were still her family. She still loved them, but something inside her had changed forever. "I'm not leaving because I hate you," she said quietly. "I'm leaving because I don't know how to keep living here after everything I've learned." Angela broke down completely. "Please give us another chance." Zoe gently shook her head. "For 10 years, I believed every sacrifice I made was bringing me closer to this family." She paused for a moment before continuing. "Now I know I was only getting farther away from myself." Ronald lowered his head, unable to hold back his tears. He wanted to apologize again, but no words felt big enough to carry the weight of what he had done. Zoe picked up her suitcase once more. "I'm tired," she said softly. "For the first time in my life, I want to live for myself." She opened the front door and stepped outside. Angela cried out her name and tried to follow, but Adam gently held her back. He knew there was nothing left he could say to stop his daughter. Zoe walked toward the waiting taxi without looking back. As the car slowly pulled away from the house, she looked out the window at the place she had spent 10 years trying to protect. It was still standing exactly where it had always been, but somehow, it no longer felt like home. The taxi dropped Zoe off in front of a small hotel on the edge of town. After checking into the cheapest room she could find, she placed her suitcase beside the bed and sat down without turning on the lights. The room was quiet. For the first time in almost 10 years, she had nowhere she needed to be the next morning. No cruise ship waiting at the port, no family waiting for her at home, no plan for what came next. Over the following days, Zoe searched for work nearby. She updated her resume, visited several hotels, and applied for housekeeping positions wherever she could. Some places weren't hiring. Others offered wages that were barely enough to cover rent. Every evening, she returned to the same small room feeling more uncertain than the day before. One night, while looking through her wallet to pay for another night's stay, a familiar business card slipped onto the bed. Zoe picked it up and stared at it for a long time. Autumn Anderson. She immediately remembered the day they had said goodbye on the cruise ship. "If you ever need anything, call me." Zoe slowly lowered the card. She had never liked asking anyone for help. For 10 years, she had been the one carrying other people's burdens. Calling Autumn felt like admitting she had finally reached the end of her own strength. She held the card in silence for several more minutes before taking a deep breath and dialing the number. The phone rang only once. "Hello?" Autumn's warm voice came through the speaker. Zoe suddenly didn't know what to say. "It's Zoe." There was a brief pause. Then Autumn smiled before answering, as though she had been expecting this call all along. "I've been wondering when you'd finally call." Zoe lowered her head, embarrassed. "I'm sorry to bother you." "You're not bothering me," Autumn replied gently. "Where are you?" After hearing Zoe's answer, Autumn spoke only 3 words. "Come to Charleston." Zoe closed her eyes. For the first time since leaving home, she felt as though she finally knew where to go. The following afternoon, Zoe arrived in Charleston, carrying nothing but a suitcase and the uncertainty she had been living with since leaving home. Autumn was already waiting outside the airport. The moment she saw Zoe walking toward her, she smiled warmly and gave her a gentle hug, as though welcoming back a member of her own family instead of someone she had only met a few months earlier. Neither of them mentioned the phone call. Neither of them talked about what had happened back home. Autumn simply took Zoe's suitcase and led her to the car. During the drive, they talked about ordinary things. The weather, the flight, the city. Nothing more. Autumn seemed to understand that Zoe wasn't ready to reopen the wound she had spent days trying to hold together. About 30 minutes later, they arrived at Autumn's home. It wasn't a mansion despite the Anderson family's wealth. It was a quiet house overlooking the water, surrounded by old oak trees and a small garden that Autumn cared for herself. She opened the front door and led Zoe upstairs. "This room has been empty for years," Autumn said with a gentle smile. "Stay here as long as you need." Zoe looked around the room. The bed had already been made with fresh sheets. Clean towels were neatly folded on a chair. Fresh flowers sat beside the window. Everything had been prepared before she arrived. She turned toward Autumn, her eyes beginning to redden. "Thank you." Autumn simply smiled. "Go take a shower. Get some rest. We can talk another day." She quietly closed the bedroom door behind her, leaving Zoe alone for the first time since arriving. Zoe slowly sat down on the edge of the bed and looked around the peaceful room. No one was asking her for money. No one was asking her to solve another problem. No one expected anything from her at all. For the first time in many years, she felt completely safe. The next morning, Zoe woke up before sunrise out of habit. For a moment, she forgot she was no longer living on a cruise ship. She instinctively reached for the uniform that had hung beside her bed for almost 10 years before remembering there was nowhere she needed to report that morning. She quietly made the bed, walked downstairs, and found Autumn already preparing breakfast in the kitchen. "Good morning," Autumn said with a smile. "Did you sleep well?" Zoe nodded. "Better than I have in a long time." They ate together while watching the morning light spread across the backyard. After breakfast, Autumn disappeared upstairs for a few minutes before returning with an envelope. She placed it gently on the table and pushed it towards Zoe. "There's some money in there," she said calmly. "Use it until you figure out what you want to do next." Zoe looked at the envelope but made no move to pick it up. She remained silent for several seconds before gently pushing it back toward Autumn. "I'm sorry." Autumn looked at her with quiet curiosity. "I can't accept it." "Why not?" Zoe lowered her eyes. "Because if I take it, I'll only be replacing one person who carries me with another." Autumn didn't interrupt. She simply listened. "I've spent the last 10 years living for someone else's problems," Zoe continued softly. "If I'm really going to start over, I want to stand on my own this time." She looked up and met Autumn's eyes. "I don't need money." She paused before finishing the sentence. "I just need an opportunity to work." Autumn remained silent for a few moments before slowly smiling. Without another word, she pulled the envelope back toward herself. The money had never been what she wanted Zoe to accept. She had only wanted to understand the kind of person standing in front of her. And at that moment, Autumn became more certain than ever that she had not been wrong about Zoe on the cruise ship. Over the next few weeks, Zoe slowly settled into a new routine. Every morning, she helped Autumn water the flowers before preparing breakfast together. In the afternoons, she accompanied Autumn to meetings, organized paperwork, and learned more about the travel industry than she ever had while working on the cruise ship. One weekend, Nick invited both of them to visit a quiet coastal town a few hours from Charleston. He had been considering it as a possible destination for future tours and wanted his mother's opinion before making any decisions. As the three of them walked through the town, Nick talked about hotel prices, transportation, and schedules. Autumn listened carefully, but said very little. Instead, she turned to Zoe. "What do you think?" Zoe looked around for a moment before answering. "The town is beautiful, but I don't think our guests would remember the hotel." Nick looked at her with curiosity. "Why?" "Because the best part isn't here," Zoe replied. She pointed toward a small, family-owned bakery across the street, where several elderly locals were sitting outside, laughing over coffee. "If I were planning this trip, I'd bring them there instead. Let them meet the owners, taste fresh bread, and stay long enough to enjoy the afternoon instead of rushing to the next stop." Nick stood quietly for a moment before smiling. "I never even noticed that place," Zoe laughed softly. "Most people don't. They're too busy looking for famous attractions." The three of them spent the rest of the afternoon exploring the town together, stopping whenever Zoe noticed another place that felt warm, welcoming, and authentic. By the time they drove back to Charleston, Nick had filled several pages of his notebook with ideas he hadn't considered before. As they pulled into the driveway, he looked over at Zoe with a grin. "I'm starting to understand why Mom wanted you here. Autumn smiled but didn't say a word. She simply looked at Zoe with quiet pride. For the first time in many years, Zoe didn't feel like someone who had been given a place out of kindness. She felt like someone whose ideas truly mattered. One afternoon, Autumn and Zoe drove out to a small coastal town a couple of hours from Charleston. Autumn wanted to revisit a place she and her late husband used to love. After walking through the quiet streets, they stopped at a family-owned seafood restaurant overlooking the water. There were no luxury decorations, no famous landmarks nearby, and no crowds of tourists rushing from one attraction to another. Even so, every table was full. The owners greeted returning guests by name, children played near the pier, and elderly couples lingered over long conversations without anyone hurrying them to leave. As they drove home that evening, Autumn smiled and asked, "Do you remember what you told me on the cruise?" Zoe looked at her curiously. "About what?" "You said people don't remember every place they visit. They remember how a place made them feel." Zoe smiled as the memory came back. "I still believe that." Autumn reached into the center console and pulled out a small notebook. Inside were pages filled with handwritten notes she had made throughout their conversations on the cruise. Ideas about slower travel, small towns, local food, meaningful experiences, giving people enough time to truly enjoy a place instead of rushing them through a schedule. Zoe looked through the pages in surprise. "You wrote all of this down?" Autumn nodded. "Every conversation we had?" She closed the notebook and looked at Zoe. "I wasn't just listening. I was thinking." Zoe smiled but didn't say anything. After a brief silence, Autumn spoke again. "I think we should stop talking about this idea." She paused before finishing her sentence, and finally build it. Zoe looked at her in disbelief. "You mean, start a company?" Autumn nodded. "You understand travelers better than anyone I've met. I know the places. I have the experience and the resources to get us started." She smiled warmly. "What I don't have is you." Zoe sat quietly for several seconds, unable to believe what she had just heard. A few months earlier, she had left home believing she had lost everything. Now, someone was asking her to help build something completely new. She slowly smiled and nodded. "Let's do it." At that moment, what had once been nothing more than a conversation between two people on a cruise ship became the beginning of an entirely new future for both of them. Autumn wasted no time after Zoe agreed to become her partner. A week later, the two of them rented a small office in downtown Charleston. It wasn't much more than 2 rooms with a meeting table, a pair of desks, and a large map hanging on one wall. Compared to the Anderson family's successful business empire, the office looked almost insignificant. But neither of them cared. They weren't trying to build the biggest travel company in the country. They only wanted to build the kind of company they believed should exist. From the very beginning, they divided the work according to their strengths. Autumn handled legal paperwork, business registrations, supplier negotiations, and relationships with local partners. Decades of experience and a lifetime of connections allowed her to open doors that would have taken most new businesses years to reach. Zoe focused on something completely different. She designed every part of the customer experience. She researched quiet coastal towns, family-owned restaurants, small local inns, and hidden places that most tour companies ignored. Instead of asking how many attractions they could fit into a schedule, she kept asking a different question. How can we help people slow down enough to truly enjoy being there? Every itinerary went through countless revisions. Zoe imagined each trip from the customer's perspective, thinking about how older travelers might feel after several hours on a bus, how much walking they could comfortably handle when they would need breaks, and what small details could make them feel genuinely cared for. Autumn often smiled whenever she watched Zoe working. She had seen this same dedication years earlier on the cruise ship, while Zoe quietly cleaned cabins no one else noticed. The only difference now was that Zoe wasn't cleaning rooms anymore. Every itinerary, every stop, and every decision now carried Zoe's signature. Weeks later, after endless planning, paperwork, phone calls, and preparation, the business officially opened its doors. The office was still small. They had only a handful of bookings. No one outside Charleston had ever heard of their company. But when Zoe looked up at the newly installed sign outside the building, she smiled quietly. For the first time in her life, she wasn't working to carry someone else's future. She was finally helping build her own. The company's first tour began with just 12 guests. Compared to the large tour groups Zoe had seen on cruise ships, it felt almost intimate. Instead of rushing from one attraction to another, the itinerary allowed plenty of time for conversations, quiet walks, and long meals at small family-owned restaurants. Throughout the trip, Zoe paid attention to every guest. She remembered who preferred a seat by the window, who needed extra time walking, and who loved listening to stories about the towns they visited. When an unexpected rainstorm forced them to cancel an outdoor activity, Zoe quickly rearranged the schedule and found a small local museum nearby. By the end of the afternoon, several guests said they had enjoyed the change even more than the original plan. As the tour came to an end, the guests gathered outside the bus before heading home. One elderly woman stepped forward and hugged Zoe warmly. "This was the first vacation in years that truly felt relaxing," she said. Another guest smiled as she signed the company's guest book. "It felt less like joining a tour and more like traveling with family." Zoe closed the guest book with a quiet smile. It wasn't just the tour that had gone well. For the first time, she realized she had helped create something people would remember long after they returned home. Over the next year, the company continued growing exactly the way Autumn and Zoe had hoped. They never chased rapid expansion or tried to fill every available seat. Instead, they focused on giving every guest an experience worth remembering. One afternoon, Zoe looked up from her desk when the office door opened. An elderly couple walked in, smiling as though they were visiting old friends. The moment Zoe recognized them, her face lit up. They had been part of the company's very first tour group. "We were hoping you'd still remember us," the husband said with a laugh. "Of course I do," Zoe replied. "Happy anniversary." The couple exchanged a surprised look. "You remembered?" Zoe smiled. 51 years this time, right?" The old woman laughed softly. "You remembered that too." Her husband reached into his bag and handed Zoe a framed photograph. It showed the two of them standing together at a quiet lighthouse during the company's very first tour. On the back, a short handwritten note read, "Thank you for reminding us that growing old doesn't mean we have to stop making new memories together." The old man smiled warmly. "We've traveled all over the country." He glanced at his wife before continuing. "But that trip was the first vacation in years that truly felt like we were spending time together instead of rushing from one place to another." He paused before asking, "We're planning another trip this fall. We were wondering." He smiled at Zoe. "Would you be leading it?" Zoe nodded with a grateful smile. "I'd be honored." As the couple left the office, Autumn had been standing quietly nearby the entire time. She looked at the framed photograph resting on Zoe's desk before smiling to herself. They had never built a company that sold vacations. They had built one that gave people moments they would carry home with them. Over the following months, more returning guests began bringing their friends, neighbors, and relatives along on future tours. Without advertisements or flashy promotions, the company's reputation quietly spread from one family to another. Little by little, it earned a place people trusted. Not because it was the biggest, but because every journey felt personal. As the company grew, so did the time Zoe spent with the Anderson family. What had started as occasional dinners gradually became part of everyday life. If Autumn was testing a new destination, Zoe was usually beside her. If there was a holiday, Nick almost always insisted they celebrate together. Without anyone ever talking about it, Zoe slowly became part of the family. One Sunday afternoon, after returning from a short research trip, the three of them gathered in Autumn's backyard to prepare lunch. Nick grilled fresh seafood while Autumn arranged vegetables she had picked from her garden that morning. Zoe carried plates from the kitchen to the patio, laughing as the two of them argued over who made the better barbecue sauce. It was an ordinary afternoon. Nothing special happened. Yet Zoe couldn't remember the last time she had felt so relaxed. There was no pressure to prove herself, no expectations she had to carry. She didn't have to earn anyone's love by sacrificing something in return. She only had to be herself. As they sat down to eat, Nick looked at Zoe and smiled. "I'm glad Mom met you on that cruise," Autumn laughed. "So am I." Nick nodded without thinking twice. "Guess I've got a sister now. She just showed up a little late." Zoe froze for a brief moment. She looked at Nick, then at Autumn. Neither of them seemed to think they had said anything unusual. To them, it was simply the truth. Zoe smiled, but this time her eyes quietly filled with tears. No one noticed. She lowered her head and took another bite of her lunch, pretending to focus on the food. Deep inside, something she had been missing for years finally found its place. She no longer felt like a guest in someone else's home. She felt like she belonged. A few years passed, and the company continued growing at a pace that felt comfortable for everyone. They never became the largest travel agency in South Carolina, but they no longer worried about finding their next customers. The people who traveled with them often came back, and many brought their friends along the following year. For Autumn, that was more than enough. One afternoon, after finishing another successful tour, Zoe walked past a small boutique she had visited years earlier while working on the cruise ship. Behind the display window sat a handmade leather handbag that looked almost identical to the one she had once picked up and quietly returned to the shelf because she couldn't bear spending money on herself. She stopped walking and smiled. This time, she stepped inside without hesitation. A few minutes later, she walked back out carrying a small shopping bag. It wasn't an expensive purchase, and it wasn't something she desperately needed. It was simply a gift she had chosen for herself. Back at the office, Zoe opened the bottom drawer of her desk and found the small notebook she had carried with her through 10 long years at sea. The pages were filled with transfer records, crossed-out balances, and countless reminders of the life she had once lived. She slowly turned to the very first page. At the top, the words family debt, $200,000 were still written in her own handwriting. Zoe quietly closed the notebook and rested her hand on its cover for a long moment. That notebook had once represented everything she believed her life was supposed to be. Duty, sacrifice, responsibility. Now it had become nothing more than a reminder of a chapter she had finally left behind. She looked at the shopping bag resting beside her desk and smiled to herself. The happiness she felt had nothing to do with finally being able to afford a handbag. It came from something much simpler. For the first time in her life, Zoe no longer felt guilty for choosing herself. At long last, she had given herself permission to be happy. 5 years passed. The small travel company Autumn and Zoe had built together had become a trusted name among travelers looking for slower, more meaningful journeys. Zoe had finally found a life that belonged to her, while hundreds of miles away, Ronald was trying to rebuild his own. Shortly after Zoe left home, he resigned from his job at the investment firm and returned to his hometown. He found work at a local hardware supply company, earning far less than he once had. But for the first time in years, every paycheck came from honest work instead of chasing risky investments. At the end of each month, Ronald walked into the same bank and deposited part of his salary into a savings account. The balance grew little by little. He never celebrated reaching another milestone. After every deposit, he simply closed the passbook, placed it back in the drawer, and went to work the next morning. That routine continued month after month, year after year. One evening, Ronald opened the passbook again and quietly looked at the balance. $50,000. He held it in silence for a long moment before walking into the living room where Adam and Angela were watching television. He placed the passbook on the table and looked at his parents. "I think," he said quietly, "I'm ready to see Zoe." Although 5 years had passed, Adam and Angela never stopped reaching out to their daughter. Every year, on Zoe's birthday, Angela sent a short message wishing her good health and happiness. The words were always simple, but they were never forgotten. Zoe always replied the same way. "Thank you, Mom. I'm doing well." At Christmas, another message would arrive. Sometimes Angela attached a photo of Adam decorating the old Christmas tree that had stood in their living room for as long as Zoe could remember. Zoe would pause for a few seconds, looking at the picture before typing her reply. "Merry Christmas. I hope you're both doing well too." The conversation usually ended there. No one brought up the past. No one mentioned the years they had lost. Yet neither side stopped sending those messages. Even after everything that had happened, they still held on to the quiet hope that one day, the distance between them might finally become a little shorter. One evening, after finishing work, Ronald returned home, carrying a worn leather briefcase he had used for years. He walked straight to his bedroom, opened the bottom drawer of his desk, and carefully took out a savings passbook. He sat quietly on the edge of the bed before opening it. Every deposit had been made with the same purpose, month after month, year after year. Ronald slowly counted the final balance before letting out a long breath. $50,000. It was nowhere near enough to repay what Zoe had lost. It wasn't even close to the amount she had spent 10 years earning on that cruise ship. but it was everything he had managed to save after 5 years of living as simply as possible. Ronald closed the passbook and walked into the living room, where Adam and Angela were watching television. The moment they saw the document in his hand, both of them immediately understood what it was. Ronald placed it gently on the coffee table. "I've made my decision," he said quietly. Adam looked at him without speaking. Ronald took a slow breath before continuing. "I want to see Zoe." Angela's eyes immediately filled with worry. "What if she doesn't want to see us?" Ronald lowered his head. "She has every right to refuse." He rested one hand on the passbook. "But whether she forgives me or not, this belongs to her." The room fell silent. Ronald looked at the savings passbook one last time before speaking again. "I'll keep working." His voice was calm but firm. "I'll keep sending her money every month until I've repaid every dollar I owe. Even if it takes the rest of my life." Adam slowly closed his eyes. For the first time in many years, he saw something he hadn't seen in his son before. Ronald was no longer trying to escape the consequences of his mistakes. He was finally ready to face them. One evening, after returning from another successful tour, Zoe and Autumn sat together on the back porch, watching the sun slowly disappear beyond the water. Neither of them spoke very much anymore. Years of friendship had made silence feel just as comfortable as conversation. Autumn poured another cup of tea before glancing towards Zoe. "Have you heard from your parents lately?" Zoe nodded. "They still send me messages every holiday." "And you still reply?" "Every time." Autumn smiled gently. "Are you still angry?" Zoe looked out at the fading sunset for a long moment before quietly shaking her head. "No." The answer came so naturally that it surprised even her. She realized she hadn't felt hatred toward her family for a very long time. What remained wasn't anger. It was distance. Autumn waited a few more seconds before asking one last question. "Then how much longer are you going to keep running from them?" Zoe didn't answer. She simply lowered her eyes and wrapped both hands around the warm cup of tea. The question stayed with her long after the conversation had ended. That night, she couldn't sleep. She lay awake, thinking about the last 5 years. She thought about the life she had rebuilt, the people who had become her family, and the peace she had finally found. Then she thought about the house she had walked away from. She suddenly realized something she had never been willing to admit before. She wasn't afraid of being hurt again. She was afraid of reopening a chapter she had fought so hard to close. Just before sunrise, Zoe quietly got out of bed, walked to the living room, and picked up her car keys from the table. When Autumn came downstairs a few minutes later, she found Zoe standing by the front door with a small overnight bag. Autumn didn't ask where she was going. She already knew. Zoe smiled softly. "I think it's time." Autumn simply walked over and gave her a gentle hug. "Drive safely." Zoe nodded before stepping outside. As she started the engine and pulled away from the house, she knew she wasn't driving back to reclaim the past. She was driving back to finally let it go. The drive back to her hometown took several hours. As the miles passed beneath her tires, the familiar road she hadn't traveled in years slowly began to reappear. The old gas station where her father used to stop on the way home from work was still there. The small diner where her family had celebrated birthdays when she was a child hadn't changed either. Time had moved on, yet so many things remained exactly as she remembered them. Zoe drove with both hands resting quietly on the steering wheel. She didn't turn on the radio. She didn't rush. Every mile gave her another moment to prepare for what waited ahead. She wasn't driving back because someone had convinced her to forgive. She wasn't driving back to rebuild the family she had once lost. She was simply returning to close a chapter that had remained unfinished for far too long. As she entered her hometown, everything suddenly felt smaller than she remembered. The streets where she had ridden her bicycle as a little girl. The grocery store where Angela used to buy dinner after work. The old church that stood at the end of the block. They had all remained there while her own life had changed beyond recognition. A few minutes later, Zoe slowly turned onto the quiet street where she had grown up. She immediately recognized the small white house at the end of the road. The paint looked older now. The fence had been repaired in several places. The flower garden her mother loved was still blooming near the front porch. Zoe pulled the car to the side of the road and turned off the engine. For a long moment, she simply sat there with both hands resting on the steering wheel. This was the house she had spent 10 years believing she was saving. It was also the house she had walked away from 5 years earlier without looking back. She took one slow breath before opening the car door. Then she stepped out, quietly walked to the front gate, and stopped. Standing only a few feet away was the home she had dreamed of returning to for half her life, and the place she had once believed she would never see again. Zoe stood quietly in front of the familiar White House for several long seconds before finally reaching out and pressing the doorbell. The sound echoed softly through the house she had once dreamed of returning to every single day while working on the cruise ship. A few moments later, footsteps approached from inside. The front door slowly opened. Angela froze the instant she saw her daughter standing on the porch. For a brief moment, she simply stared, unable to believe what she was seeing. Tears immediately filled her eyes. "Zoe," she whispered. Her voice trembled so much that it almost disappeared. Hearing Angela's voice, Adam hurried out from the living room. The moment he reached the doorway, he stopped as well. His lips parted slightly, but no words came out. 5 years. He had imagined this moment countless times, yet nothing he had rehearsed in his mind seemed possible to say anymore. Ronald stepped out a few seconds later. The moment their eyes met, he lowered his head almost instinctively. Shame still came more naturally to him than looking his sister in the eyes. None of them moved. None of them knew who should speak first. The silence that filled the front porch wasn't uncomfortable. It simply carried too many years that no conversation could ever erase. Zoe looked at each of them one by one. They all looked older than the last time she had seen them. Adam's hair had turned almost completely gray. Angela's face carried deeper lines than she remembered. Even Ronald no longer looked like the ambitious young man who had once believed he could become rich overnight. Time had changed every one of them. Zoe finally offered a small, gentle smile. "Hi, Mom. Hi, Dad." Those simple words were enough to break the silence. Angela covered her mouth as tears rolled down her cheeks. Adam quietly looked away, trying to hide the tears gathering in his own eyes. After so many years apart, the family was finally standing together again. None of them knew what would happen next. But for the first time in a very long time, they were no longer separated by distance. Ronald was the first to move. Without saying a word, he walked back into the house and returned a few moments later carrying a worn leather folder. He stopped a few feet in front of Zoe before carefully taking out a savings passbook and placing it into her hands. Zoe looked down at the balance. $50,000. She slowly raised her eyes toward Ronald. He couldn't meet her gaze. "It's everything I've saved over the last 5 years," he said quietly. "After you left, I quit my job in finance and came back home. I found an ordinary job and started over." He paused, taking a slow breath before continuing. "Every month, I put away as much money as I could. I know this isn't enough." His voice grew heavier with every word. "I know I'll never be able to give you back the 10 years you lost." Ronald finally forced himself to look at his sister. Tears had already filled his eyes. "I'm not asking you to forgive me." He gently pushed the passbook a little closer to her. "I just want to start taking responsibility." The front porch fell silent once again. Ronald lowered his head. "If you'll let me, I'll keep sending you money every month until I've repaid everything I owe, even if it takes the rest of my life." Zoe quietly looked at the passbook in her hands before looking back at her younger brother. For the first time in many years, she no longer saw the reckless young man who had run away from his mistakes. Standing in front of her was someone who had finally found the courage to face them. Zoe gently closed the savings passbook and held it with both hands for a long moment before looking back at Ronald. She slowly walked toward him and placed it back into his hands. Ronald looked at her in surprise. "Keep it," Zoe said softly. "You've earned it." Ronald immediately shook his head. "I can't." Zoe gave him a gentle smile. "Yes, you can." She paused before continuing. 5 years ago, I probably would have accepted it. Back then, I was still living in the past." Ronald lowered his eyes, unable to say anything. Zoe turned toward her parents. Adam and Angela were still standing together at the front door, waiting quietly for whatever she was about to say. Adam took one slow step forward. "I'm sorry, Zoe." His voice was calm, but filled with regret. "There isn't a single day that passes without me wishing I could go back and tell you the truth." Angela nodded through her tears. "We kept telling ourselves we were protecting this family." She wiped her face with trembling hands. "But in the end, We only hurt the person who loved us the most. Neither of them tried to justify what they had done. Neither of them blamed Ronald. They simply accepted the weight of their own choices. Zoe listened quietly until they had finished. She didn't interrupt. She didn't ask any questions. She had spent years imagining what this conversation might sound like if it ever happened. Now that it finally had, she realized she no longer needed any explanations. She took a slow breath before speaking. I've already forgiven all of you. Adam looked up in disbelief. Angela covered her mouth as fresh tears rolled down her face. Zoe's voice remained gentle. I forgave you a long time ago, she smiled sadly. But I can't become the Zoe I used to be. No one argued. No one begged her to stay. Deep down, they already understood. Forgiveness had healed the wound. It could not erase the scar. After the conversation about the past came to an end, the living room gradually became quieter. For the first time that afternoon, no one was talking about debt, mistakes, or forgiveness anymore. Angela looked at Zoe for a long moment before asking softly, What do you do now? Zoe smiled. I run a travel company. Adam looked surprised. You own it? Not by myself, Zoe replied. Autumn and I built it together. Ronald looked up. The woman you met on the cruise? Zoe nodded. She gave me a chance when I had nowhere else to go. We started small, and little by little, it grew. Adam smiled faintly. What kind of tours do you organize? We take older travelers to peaceful places, Zoe explained. Small towns, local restaurants, family-owned businesses. Places where people can slow down and enjoy being together instead of rushing from one attraction to another. Angela listened quietly before asking the question that mattered most to her. Are you happy? Zoe didn't answer immediately. She thought about Autumn, about the company they had built together, about the elderly couples who returned every year, and about the ordinary dinners she shared with Autumn and Nick after work. Then she smiled. I've never been happier. The room fell silent again. Adam lowered his eyes for a moment before speaking. Do you still live with Autumn? Yes, Zoe answered. She's become family to me. She smiled again. Nick still treats me like his little sister. Angela slowly nodded. She suddenly realized there were countless moments she had never been part of. Someone else had celebrated Zoe's successes, comforted her after difficult days, shared birthdays, holidays, and ordinary family dinners. While they had spent years hoping for another chance, another family had quietly been there, helping their daughter build a life they knew almost nothing about. No one said another word. They simply looked at Zoe, grateful that she had found the happiness they had once taken from her. A little while later, Zoe stood up from the living room sofa and picked up her car keys. No one asked her to stay. No one tried to stop her from leaving. Adam, Angela, and Ronald simply walked her to the front door. They all understood that this visit had never been about returning home. It had been about saying goodbye to the pain they had carried for far too many years. Before getting into her car, Zoe turned back one last time. She looked at the small white house that had once been the center of her entire world. It no longer represented sacrifice, regret, or betrayal. It had simply become a place filled with memories, both beautiful and painful, that had shaped the person she was today. Zoe smiled gently. Take care of yourselves. Angela nodded through her tears. You too, sweetheart. Adam quietly placed one hand on Ronald's shoulder as they watched Zoe climb into her car. None of them waved. They simply stood there until the car slowly disappeared at the end of the street. Several hours later, Zoe pulled into the driveway of Autumn's house in Charleston. Before she even turned off the engine, the front door opened. Autumn stepped outside with the same warm smile she had worn ever since the day Zoe first arrived, carrying nothing but a suitcase and a broken heart. Nick followed a moment later, waving as he walked toward the car. Welcome home, he said with a grin. Zoe smiled as she stepped out and hugged them both. A few minutes later, the three of them were sitting around the dinner table, talking about the next tour they planned to visit, laughing over ordinary stories from the week, and passing dishes from one side of the table to the other. Nothing extraordinary happened that evening. It was simply another quiet family dinner. Zoe looked around the table for a brief moment before smiling to herself. 10 years earlier, she had believed a home was something she had to protect at any cost. Now she finally understood the truth. A home was never the place you sacrificed yourself to keep. It was the place where you were loved, respected, and free to be yourself. And after a journey that had changed her life forever, Zoe had finally found hers. If you enjoyed this story, please like this video and subscribe to the channel to support us. Thank you so much for watching.